Yes, public television is under attack. But no one is giving up at PBS's Frontline. I speak with its executive producer, Raney Aronson-Rath. I'm Thom Powers, and this is Pure Nonfiction. I know it's been a few months since our last episode, but I've been on the road recording interviews that we'll share this spring from locations as varied as Nairobi and Copenhagen. Our podcast is celebrating its 10th anniversary this year. Whether you're a longtime follower or a newcomer, thank you for listening. I want to plug two upcoming events. I'll be in Warsaw for the festival Millennium Docs Against Gravity on the weekend of May 9th and 10th. Then I'll be in Chicago on May 16th to talk about my book Mondo Documentary at the Nighthawk Bar. For details, see our Instagram page at Pure Nonfiction. Now for this episode. That's the longtime opening music to PBS's current affairs show, Frontline. The series was founded in 1983 by David Fanning. He led the program for decades until passing the baton to my guest, Raney Aronson-Rath. When she took over 11 years ago, Frontline was known for its reliable format guided by a narrator. Under Raney's tenure, Frontline still delivers quality journalism, but she's also ventured into more individual styles of storytelling. In this conversation, we touch upon a few of those films. One is Abacus Small Enough to Jail, about a family bank in New York's Chinatown. Another is For Sama, that brings a first-person view on the war in Syria. And a third is 20 Days in Mariupol, about Russia's war against Ukraine. That won the Academy Award. If you dig into the Pure Nonfiction archives, you'll find interviews with all three of those filmmakers. I'll put links in our show notes. This is the first time Raney has talked much about her new venture, Frontline Features, that will place select documentaries into movie theaters. Among those titles is One in a Million, that recently won the Sundance Audience and Directing Awards for World Documentary. Directed by Atab Azam and Jack McInnes, One in a Million follows a family of Syrian refugees in Germany for over 10 years. You'll hear more about it in this interview. Raney has steered Frontline through a tumultuous era. Traditional TV was already losing ground to YouTube and Netflix, and then last year, President Trump and Elon Musk brought an end to the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Somehow, Raney keeps a sense of optimism, and it doesn't sound false. She spoke to me from her office in Boston. I asked her to describe what Frontline was like when she started.
I mean, first of all, I was a filmmaker for Frontline for almost a decade. So one of the things that I don't get to talk about that a lot, but I made multiple documentaries for Frontline, and a lot of the work that I did was really around the culture war. So it's a deep passion of mine to try to understand, parts of the country that don't often get covered. And so I did a really important film called The Last Abortion Clinic in Mississippi. I did a film about George W. Bush's evangelical faith and how that was driving the evangelical vote in his election. And then I did a really influential on me film called News War, which really looked at the changing news industry and what it really means for journalism. And then David Fanning, our founder, asked me to become a senior producer. And so I joined Frontline as a senior producer, and I really came into a series that was, because it would be appropriate then, a broadcast series with one big differentiator. So there was this really interesting thing about Frontline at the time, which is they had built their own video player on the internet. I know that sounds super old-fashioned, but that's like 15 years ago, 20 years ago. So they had to hand build a player. And I was young, and I was somebody who was already doing on-demand watching with TiVo. So I was like the first of my friend group to have TiVo. And you're nodding, so like you maybe had
I
TiVo
was right there
too,
too. Yeah, it was.
right? So there were a few of us who had TiVo. And I think the thing was that for me, uh, this just made perfect sense. You know, long form streaming on demand a long time ago made a lot of sense. But, you know, Frontline was primarily a broadcast. I was a young director in the midst of that, and then became a young senior producer. Looking back, I had a lot to learn. And I was basically the number two of the show for about 6 or 7 years before I became executive producer, which is now 11 and a half years ago, which is amazing to think that it's been 11 and a half years. And a lot has changed.
But just to recap this, you were taking over from the founder. So
Yes.
before you, there was one guy who was overseeing this, and then you take over 11 years ago, which happens to coincide with a lot
Of
of
change.
change.
A lot of change. And also, I think back to that time, and I mean, it's kind of amazing to think that, yes, he's the founder, he's the only other executive producer of Frontline, and he had a built-in group of producers and directors that he worked with through that entire time. A couple of those amazing directors are still with us. And what I was given a challenge of when I joined him as the number two of the show was finding the next generation of storytellers for Frontline. So I was given that as my remit. So that's kind of amazing. It's interesting to think back that I was given that freedom as a person who is not quite yet in charge to think about voice, to think about who should be our storytellers, to think about what stories we should tell. I mean, and a great example is thinking about how many films we did about war, right? And how many films, it was very important current affairs work. But then there's For Sama, right? Which is told by Wad Al-Khatib, and it's really a story about a mother, a woman, a person going through war herself and filming herself. And like that became sort of a beacon for me. Like, how can we tell very important current affairs stories that have investigative journalism at the heart of it, but how can we expand our voice? And that was my remit once upon a time. And then that really is my passion. And that's my passion today, by the way. That's what I love to do. I love to work with people like, Etab and Jack, and these people are coming underneath the Frontline banner, but really are filmmakers in their own right, but they haven't produced for us before. That's a lot. That's really what inspires me.
Well, let me ask you about format because, my memory of, Frontline in the 90s and 2000s under David Fanning was that it was, this reliable format with the same narrator, and you've got a range of producers, but they're working in a similar visual style. You can expect that the interviews are going to be shot in a kind of house style. And over the years, I can remember a few diversions from that. I think The Farmer's Wife, wasn't that
Yes,
a
David
Frontline series? That
Sutherland's,
was
of course, yeah.
times when Frontline, would acquire a piece or partner with filmmakers who were working in a more authored style. But those occasions seemed so rare 25 years ago that they became something to remark upon. That Frontline's shaking up their format, and so when you step in 11 years ago, how were you thinking about format?
Yeah, that's a great question. So first of all, I have very diverse taste. So, leadership when it comes to the creative lead of a show, right, of a series, it really does come down to how do you like stories to be told truly, right? And the people around me. And for me, I mean, my genesis moment with documentary filmmaking was actually sitting at the Film Forum watching Steve James's Hoop Dreams once upon a time when I was 25. And so that's what I loved back then, right? That's why I decided to do documentary filmmaking instead of print journalism. I was actually a journalism student at Columbia at the time as a writer, and I went to see his film and I was completely transported to another world. So my taste ranges to, you know, cinematic works of Steve and many others, right? And also these very quick turnaround narrated and very reporter driven films. Like we did last night was a film about Bukele and Trump and the gangs. And I basically had the Alfaro newsroom reporters really telling that story. So I love a very quickly turned around, current affairs hour of, what you would say more traditional television. And then I also love these epics. I love an epic documentary. It's what I watch, it's what I do on my weekends. And, I've just thought so deeply about this. I've learned so much from every single filmmaker that I've worked with that it's also just a really gratifying experience for me as a person and a leader to have that privilege to work with them. And so I'm all about authorship for them. And that's actually the really interesting role I do play is I'm the editor in chief of the show and the executive producer, but I really do see this as, almost like book authors, like in that very traditional sense of allowing people to have their own cinematic storytelling method. I mean, if you look at For Sama versus Abacus, those are very different films. Or if you look at 20 Days in Mariupol, and then even the stretch that Mstislav and Michelle took for 2,000 meters to Andreevka, right? Very different vernaculars and the way that they're telling stories. And then, like I said, this very current affairs driven, hour that we did yesterday that really put on the record what we're seeing happening right now. It's actually a real privilege when I think about that range that we're able to do. And so I think in that regard, I have expanded into the world of cinematic storytelling, also in part because filmmakers want to tell stories that way that I want to work with. So I've also been led by filmmakers themselves, and I've learned a lot. I can think of people like Ramona Diaz, in A Thousand Cuts. That film was very influential on me because, that was a story we kept telling out of the Philippines about, Duterte, but she took it inside the story of Maria Reza and Rappler. So sometimes filmmakers are opening up the door for me to see, oh, this is how we should tell that story. That's a miracle if you think about the people who are out in the world telling stories. And so that open door is like what I'm looking for. I like a unique story. I like things to surprise me. And so that's not going to come from me, right? That's going to come from the people actually gathering and thinking about how best to tell their stories.
But what was there like any kind of institutional deliberation about
That's a great question.
because it used to be that like if you said, oh, that's a Frontline show,
Yes.
you think you know what that is, with a few different exceptions. And all these wonderful films and filmmakers that you've just mentioned, do not fit a house style the way we once thought of, the way I think we thought of Frontline when you joined.
Yes. Okay. Fair enough. And I think that's true. So, was there a deliberation? Not necessarily. I think what happened in my world is I know this doesn't sound like this is what happened, but this is actually what happened. What really happens in my world is that we commission film by film. And so organically, we started to commission bigger pieces of work because that's what I wanted to do, frankly. And I was starting to get pitches that I thought were very significant. So let's just talk about Abacus for a moment, because that was an important moment for me. And the precursor to that was when I was the senior producer was Steve's film, The Interrupters, which I thought was brilliant, by the way. That film taught me a lot because I noticed right away that on the broadcast, it didn't do so well as a rater. But on our streaming website, because this is pre-YouTube, right? YouTube is huge for Frontline now. But at the time, what I saw was a younger generation was really hungry to watch The Interrupters. And it wasn't just about the topic and the territory, it was about the way in which they told that urgent story out of Chicago. It was like that story is so vital, right? But the way they told it was just completely well, no narration, first of all, but beyond that, the vernacular was just on the ground. You were with the people and you fell in love with the characters. And so I watched our audience go really passionate for that, but it was a different audience than the PBS traditional audience on broadcast. And frankly, Tom, I want both, right? I want the streaming audience and I want the traditional audience too. And so what Abacus showed me, which is Steve's next film for Frontline,
And so I should just take a moment. So it's
yeah,
called Abacus Small Enough to Jail. It's takes place after the 2008 economic meltdown, and it's a family founded bank in New York's Chinatown, a Chinese American family who leads this bank, um, and they got prosecuted in a way that none of the big banks were being prosecuted. They, had all this legal muscle of the government brought against them, and they were a small bank who refused to take a plea deal, believed in the integrity of what they were doing, and stood up to it. It was nominated for an Academy Award. If people haven't seen it, go watch Abacus Small Enough to Jail,
thank you,
directed
Tom.
by Steve James.
That was amazing. You're a great storyteller. I guess you do this for a living. No, but one of the things about that film that I realized that we could bring to the table. So Steve brought us the rushes and scenes from the family and what they were going through, and I was really compelled by this family. I just thought this is a story that matters, right? And it has that perfect intersection of investigative journalism, current affairs, and character. It's just literally a dream. What they didn't have was a prosecution. What they didn't have were the prosecutors who were pressing the case. And so we attached an investigative reporter to their team named Nick Verbitsky, who just completely tore it down and was going after those other voices. And those other voices made it into the film. And I realized, okay, there's a way in which we can be additive to these films. Our journalism and opening doors and truly the accountability journalism that we're known for can be infused inside these cinematic films. It was like a light bulb moment that I just had, that there's a way for us to have our sort of special secret sauce, which is the journalistic endeavor inside these bigger pieces of work. And for me, that meant, okay, I also got to see some very interesting things happen. Like I got to watch Julie Goldman working with Steve, and I thought, oh, that director producer relationship is something I had never witnessed before. That collaboration that they have, that sort of strategic, beautiful thing that happens between a director and a producer. And I looked at her as almost like a role model for me. Somebody I look up to her anyway, quite a bit, right? I always had, but I got to see her up close, like the way in which she thinks about the impact of these films. I had never thought about things like how do you bring a film like that into communities? Because remember, I'm a journalist and I made films for Frontline before I became the boss. So that was my training. So I think that was another big wake up call for me was that you can take these documentaries into the actual world and that could have an impact that was not as tangible on the broadcast. It's not that the broadcast isn't important. It's that there's so much more you could do. So I just watched her. I frankly just observed the whole thing. And I watched Chris Clements in the edit with Steve. And I just watched that whole dynamic unfold. And I learned a lot. And I thought maybe we can do something here with Frontline's DNA that could be transformative. And you've seen me do that over and over again. And I think what then happened was we also have the current affairs space that we need to satisfy, which is, obviously it's been 11, almost 12 years that I've been running Frontline. A lot has happened. So you've seen us respond in real time with some very good, important, traditionally told Frontline films. Like I would say this year, past year, Trump's Power and the Rule of Law. It's a very important film by Michael Kirk and his team, right? You see other big current affairs docs because I think we still need to be on the record, journalistically speaking, in a more quick turnaround journalistic way. So I can do both now. And again, it's important to do both, in my opinion, because, there is such a dearth of fair, fact-based journalism right now. I want to be able to do both, and that's the privilege that I have, right? It's just how good are we? How smart are we? How thoughtful are we? Um, yeah.
So let me ask you about this existential meteor that hits public television last year when the Trump administration defunded the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Um, that was a year ago. How do you respond to that? I mean, there are other venerable public television pillars that have, pulled back or, closed shop. What you do was built for a system that kind of doesn't exist anymore.
So, well, one thing I would say is that there's just no question when Congress defunded us, it was devastating for everyone when in public media. And then when the Corporation for Public Broadcasting closed down, when that final thing just happened, it was almost like a gut punch. None of us in public media feel anything other than devastated at what happened. And then, therefore, I also feel extremely motivated to make sure we survive. I mean, it's like a survival feeling right now of we have to make sure that there is some independent work out there that is not, frankly, corporate owned or overrun or whatever you want to call it, right? We have to make sure that there's a place for the work that we do that doesn't actually exist in other places. And so this is why I think a lot of what you're seeing PBS do right now and stations, you saw the Bridge Fund, you saw a lot of foundations come together to say the stations need the money first. The rural stations need the money. And then if they have funding, it can still go into the National Programming Service, and PBS can still fund the series, the National Programming Service series like Frontline and Nova and others. And so that is something that is happening. That doesn't mean that it's easy. And like the fundraising effort is really huge right now. Membership is up. I mean, I'm pretty encouraged that a lot of Americans have come forward to actually help us. And I guess I feel like we're here, we're all doing this. And I say this to my team every day. I said, all of this is happening, but all of us are still here. We're still telling the stories that matter. We're still making the films. We're still airing the films. We still have distribution. We have streaming distribution. We have broadcast distribution. That's amazing. And we're a nonprofit, so we don't have a stakeholder environment. This is very important, especially for investigative journalism in all the ways that Frontline expresses it now. That's very important. So I am a half glass full person, but I will not lie that the last year has been hard for all of us.
So, I mean, that's one existential threat to what you do. But I think there's a separate one, which is just the way audience engagement has changed. In the heyday, well, I don't say what the heyday of Frontline is. I hope right now is the heyday of
Thank you.
Frontline.
I think the
But
heydays today.
and I think there's a good argument to make for that. In the foundational period of Frontline, there was, a night of the week when you could reliably tune in to watch at 9 p.m. or whatever it was on your local dial. And I remember those days. I remember what was it, Tuesday night? I can't remember what night it was, but
Tuesday.
yeah,
Yes.
Tuesday nights. That's something to do. I'm going to be intellectually engaged, and go to bed on Tuesday night knowing a little bit more about the world than when I woke up that day, because that's on at 9 p.m. That engagement with television does not exist.
No, I mean right, because I mean that is true, right? Like what you just said was we're still on Tuesday night, by the way, at 10 p.m. And people do watch us. A lot of people, millions of people still watch television, which is amazing. And it's great. And it's across the country. And that matters to me because, there's a lot of people who watch Frontline who can't afford cable still. So I know it's like remembering, I try to remember all the time that, we do air across the country on a channel in a way that if you don't have cable and you don't have Netflix and you don't have an app, and you don't watch the media like we do now, there's still a way to watch Frontline. And we see it in the numbers. People still do watch Frontline. Where we see massive growth, which is why I'm convinced we're built for this era, is on streaming. So one of the really special things about Frontline is that 8 years ago, I was able to work with PBS, and it was really because I wanted us to be on YouTube, and there's a reason for that. I had a 14-year-old son who was agitating all the time to get Frontline onto YouTube. I mean, he wouldn't leave me alone. So this is great for us now. But back then, I was kind of driving everyone crazy. But I was able to show PBS that it would not actually hurt the broadcast audience. These are different people. There's no cannibalizing happening here at all. And we started to share all of our films on YouTube. So every single Frontline film is in front of the paywall on YouTube. And what we saw as a consequence is our numbers just blew up. So like we have 7 million people that just watch us on YouTube every month on average. The average watch time is like 30 minutes. And just to tell all your documentary listeners, one of the top search terms to get to Frontline is just the word documentary. Young people love documentary films. They love them. They even love our like vintage work too. They love anything that looks and sounds real. They love it. They comment on it. They're like crazy for it. So we think that actually right now, this is the best time because, Frontline can be heavy at 10 p.m. on a Tuesday night, right? And that's okay. And that type of television, appointment television, really is limited now to like live events and sports, right? But people still do watch us. But I see massive growth streaming now. And it's very encouraging. The other thing that changed for us because of this is we are now a global show. The crazy truth of the matter is until December, 35% of our audience was global. Today, 60% of our audience is global. So that changes how I think. I'm very
And when you say global, encountering
for
you on
streaming. Yeah,
YouTube
on
or
YouTube
yeah.
and streaming in general. So if you think about streaming as not just US based, right? That so it is mostly YouTube that takes us so global, but we're actually also quite a big TV show in the rest of the world. We just air on Arte or our co-producing partners. So we count all of that because that matters to us too. So that's a very interesting thing to think about. Like the commissioning ecosystem is changing. And a lot of us who are commissioners and editors now are thinking across the globe. That's very exciting. What is the most important work that we can do, And the other thing about YouTube for us is, and I learned this actually with 1,000 Cuts, is that we were able to stream 1,000 Cuts in the Philippines, right? Because nobody in the Philippines would buy that film to broadcast it. So I used Frontline's YouTube channel almost as like a democracy moment. It was just an idea I had in the middle of the night where I was like, oh, wait, we need to reach Filipinos with this film. It would be crazy not to. It's a film about the Philippines told by Ramona Diaz. And so I bought the rights from Ramona and the distribution company. They were affordable. And I put it on YouTube. And now one of our biggest audiences on YouTube are the Philippines. Like the Philippines loves Frontline because of 1,000 Cuts. But it's a different way of thinking. Back to your question about, Frontline today versus Frontline 12 years ago. It's a completely different way to think about the globe as our audience. And that is awesome if you think about it. Like the potential. And what I love to do, I really love to do this more than pretty much anything, is work with local filmmakers to tell stories from their countries. Like it really matters to me. So we are commissioning more films globally because we have the audience, and also it's what I love to do. I love to work with, the folks who did the film on El Salvador. That's the El Faro newsroom, right? Those are people who are from El Salvador reporting there. Well, now they're living in exile because they might be arrested, but that's it. That's beside the point. They are reporters from El Salvador who really know best how to tell their story.
So let me ask you about recent Frontline production that debuted at Sundance, called One in a Million, that follows a girl. She's a girl when the film begins in 2015 from Syria, as her family is fleeing the war and trying to find a place to live in Europe. And the filmmakers follow her for 10 years, into her 20s. We see a lot happen with her and her family. The film won an audience prize at the Sundance Film Festival. And so, tell me about when you encountered this film that's been the making for 10 years, and what drew you to it.
Well, I would say that One in a Million is really special because we started right when they started the film Once Upon a Time. So it's 10 years ago. And Keo Films, so that's Will Anderson and that crowd, sent me some footage of the young girl who's Isra, who's just an incredible character. And there were a number of filmmakers working at the time on telling the story of the Exodus, essentially from the Middle East into Europe. And so we came on board once a long time ago, 10 years ago, for another documentary that we did that was very character driven. One of the first films I did on my own as an executive producer was, how do you tell that refugee story, the story of all those people, but let the people tell the story? There were no reporters in it. It was kind of like, looking back, maybe a bit of a risky move on my part to just say like, hey, let's let them tell the story. But it was very powerful. And we met Isra and we met her. I'll never forget even the raw footage of her. Just, okay, she's a great character. And then over that decade, essentially Jack and Etab continued to film her story. And we all thought she was a great character, but we had no idea what was going to happen to her. So it has been 10 years. And I have to say, people like Mandy Chang and others also, just, it's not just me, right? It's all these people really believed in her story. And I believed in her story particularly because through her, we could see what was happening in Europe. We had no idea, by the way, Thom, back then, that what was going to happen in Germany. We didn't know that the rise of the AfD was going to transpire. We didn't understand the anti-Muslim and the type of sort of the shift in tone that was going to happen in Germany over that decade. But through Israel, we can see all of that happen. And yet she's such a strong character. She's so resilient. And her mother, I just love her mother, I have to say. Her mother, Nisreen, to me was just amazing. It could be generational, like we're similar ages probably. I mean, she's younger than me, but whatever. I just love the two of them. And I love the fact that they have different journeys. And that's how it really is, right? It really is like everybody has their own journey. So you can kind of see the differences in the way that they lived through that decade together. And it's just profound. The way, and this is really Jack and Etab, the two directors.
So when you signed on to this 10 years ago, I assume you knew it was going to be longitudinal, but did you know it was going to be 10 years longitudinal?
No, no. And I will say that things kept happening to Isra, right? And there were certain times, like, certainly after like 2021, like there's some pivotal moments, and you see it in the film, right, that are very difficult. I can remember a couple of times we all talked to say like, hey, is this the right story to keep keep following. Jack and Etab are very careful with their trust and their relationship. So at any point, we felt that this wasn't the story to tell or it wasn't the right time. We kept waiting. And so it became a kind of funny conversation of like, well, is it this year? Maybe not. We'll keep doing it. And actually, I have done that with a couple of really important stories lately. And I feel like we can learn something through these longitudinal films that you can't learn in a single year's production. And we didn't put artificial boundaries on the time. And that's a privilege, right? To be able to, and the BBC Storyville was in too, and there's a couple of other co-producers that came in globally. And everybody after 2021, we're all putting like a little money in to keep the development, to keep the filming going. It wasn't, okay, this is going to become an epic documentary film. It wasn't like that. It was just, this is an important story. Let's all keep trying to keep it going. And especially the last 5 years, Frontline has been, me personally invested in how is this story going to unfold? And we all fell in love with Israel, and importantly, her whole family.
So talk to me about where Frontline is now, because I feel like, contrary to what one might guess from the outside, as CPB is being defunded and you kind of expect institutions to shrink, it feels like Frontline is growing. So tell me about that.
Well, I mean, first of all, you asked that great question about whether or not there was sort of a quorum of people that made a decision to take Frontline in a different direction once upon a time. And I explained it was really built almost like brick by brick, like film by film. Our sensibilities organically and mind driving really did help organically change and expand what we do. And then I decided, okay, we need to call this something. We need to call this something because I care about it so deeply. I want to be able to champion this. And I was hearing from a lot of filmmakers their challenges, right, in with distribution especially, and getting support for very important films that touch on sensitive and very important issues, right? So I thought, and this started a couple of years ago, okay, we need to call it something, we need to name it something, and like, okay, well, now's as good a time as any. So we do have a division now called Frontline Features. And Jack, actually, McKinn is the director, in ETOB, said Frontline Features on the stage at Sundance for the first time. They said the brand name, and it just took my breath away because nobody had said it out loud. It'd been on the screen, right? But when he said it there, I didn't ask him to even. He just said it. It was like one of those breathtaking moments, that I realized, oh wow, this does have momentum. This does have something behind it. Well, it's me and the whole team, but it's just this idea that a filmmaker said it in that setting was very emotional and important. And so Frontline is expanding. We are. And we're also doing the real work of fundraising and working hard with foundations and individuals and PBS to make sure we can sustain our budget. We're doing every single thing we can to survive. I think it's really important because I don't see a lot of this work happening out there. I know people want to do this work. That's the other thing that drives me. There's so many well-meaning filmmakers out in the world who want to tell stories, who have the ability to, that don't have an outlet. And we can't do them all, but we can certainly do more than we've been doing.
And so what does Frontline Features mean? What is that doing?
So I'm starting to talk about this more. You're really the first person I'm talking to on a podcast, so bear with me. But so Frontline Features is really anything that is feature length, and we are thinking actively about shorts as well. We had one short film we did on Venezuela that's really beautiful with ProPublica, and we called that a Frontline Feature. But that's our only short that we've done in a Frontline Feature way. But essentially, we're going to have 2 or 3, maybe 4 big feature-length films a year. Ideally for Frontline, because of our journalism standards and the way in which we review our films, we get involved early. So you won't see me making except it's very special. Actually, there's only one film that I've actually commissioned, right, or acquired, I guess is a better word, out of a festival. But I think better for Frontline is when filmmakers come to us with ideas, that they're starting to think about. They have something special, a special story they want to tell. They have special access. They have a reason they should be the ones to tell it. Or sometimes filmmakers will come to me and say, why haven't you done X? You should be doing it. And then they have a way to tell the story that I think is unique enough for us to say yes to. So there's all sorts of different ways that filmmakers bring important stories to us. I have a little team, which is very exciting. We just hired Marjan Javadi and a couple of other people to join me to help on that side. I have a little advisory council. It has people like Nina Fialka and Simon Kilmurray on it. And so we're building a little team around me to help make good decisions. And our hope is that we're involved from if it's not right at the beginning, right in the development stage or right as production is starting. That's ideal for Frontline.
I want to ask you about how you pick topics to focus on, because you can only do so many films each year. Within the United States itself, there are, big political and cultural topics to take on. When we think of some of the most prominent frontline projects in recent years is, of course, the two films from Ukraine by Mstislav Chernov. You've now that's at least two major works on Syria, For Sama, and now One in a Million. Probably others you've done. But how there's a whole world of stories, and of course this is something that I think about often as a festival programmer. Although it's easier for me as a festival programmer because I probably have more films that I can get behind than you can. So I'd love to hear how you look at the globe and ask yourself, where should we direct our attention and resources?
So it's a great question. And just as a sort of 30,000-foot view over Frontline. So we do have 20 broadcasts and films a year. So we have 20. And so that's sort of like the A1 only 20 times is the way I kind of think about it. And and we have done a lot of the big features that you just mentioned, but just as importantly, we do broadcast films that also stream. And so we've done a lot of work on Putin. We did, a year of war on the Palestinians and Israelis. We just did a very big film about Netanyahu and Iran that was much more current affairs in the sense of there are times when I feel like we need to put people that we have to hold to account in an interview setting and talk to them about the journalism that we're finding and unraveling, especially on the investigative side. So, I'm thinking about James Jacoby's film this winter. It was a very important film that was really wrangling with that very important issue. And sometimes those films don't get mentioned as much, but they get really streamed. Like the millions of people are watching that film right now and others, or the Bukele film that looked at El Salvador and the relationship with Trump and also with the gangs there. So there's a way in which I think across what needs to be current and what needs to go fast, what needs to be in public fast, and then what can have these more longitudinal looks. And so the longitudinal big feature films, that is like kismet when it happens, right? One in a Million just became that. It organically became that. I have another film that we've been following, a platoon of soldiers since almost 20 years now. And so that film, for example, could become a feature. We're not sure yet. That could also be a broadcast, but we're just not sure. So we are thinking across those two different vernaculars, right? Like what can really grow into a feature and what can't. And we do have a global perspective, but we're mostly focused on U.S. accountability journalism because you don't see a lot of that right now in the space that I'm in. We used to think about what can we do that others aren't. And instead of being competitive with 60 Minutes, for example, or other big shows that are more current affairs based, we would think, okay, what can we do in our space? But now there's so little of this work. We feel that we need to do more than ever. So we have a film on, for example, the Crown Prince of Mohammed bin Salman, and the current administration. And we have a very big current affairs film on that coming out in June. We have a film called The War Cabinet that's coming out that's going to be looking at the people who are in the Trump administration currently as well. So this is the gravity of what we're doing ranges. And so I think most of the people listening will be like, oh yeah, well, we also do stream these broadcasts and we put them on PBS. And then we're also doing this big theatrical move. And those sometimes can be the same. And always when you make a feature for Frontline, you're going to have the same streaming and broadcast visibility, which I think is really great too. So it's not like we keep those in the theater. They're not bespoke films that stay in the theater. They're films that get seen by millions of people. And Mstislav Chernov, you spoke of him, millions of people got to see 20 Days in Mariupol, and millions of people got to see 2,000 meters to Andriivka. And it's amazing to think about that too. I'll say the importance of something like 20 Days in Mariupol is that, there's so much disinformation in the world right now that there's a whole alternate version of what happened in Mariupol out there that the Russians produce themselves. And so if we have these films in the public arena, in the public space, right, on YouTube and streaming in front of paywalls, that's what inspires me. Right? That's why I'm doing this job instead of another kind of job, is because I think that's really being on the record about what's actually happening. So I'm always thinking about that. I'm thinking, what does Frontline have to be on the record about? What does Frontline Features have to be on the record about? It has to be a big idea that's of consequence.
I want to thank Raney Aronson for speaking with me. You can watch Frontline on PBS or dive into the archives on YouTube. As our podcast marks its 10th anniversary, I want to give a special thanks to its 3 producers over those years. The person who was instrumental to getting me started from my basement in Montclair, New Jersey, is Michael Scotti Jr. He later headed to Hollywood to become an editor on TV series such as Daisy Jones and the Six and Nobody Wants This. Our second producer was Sarah Modo. She's now at New York's Film Forum as Director of Operations. And for the past 7 years, our series producer is Hannah Nordenswan, based in Finland. She's now completing her own feature documentary set in a cemetery in Helsinki. Thanks to Bella Racklin, who edits our Substack newsletter, Doc Voices, and to web designer Cross Strategy. Our theme music is composed by Andre Williams, and our executive producer is Raphael Nehausen. I'm Thom Powers. Follow us on Instagram and visit our website at purenonfiction.net.